Dear viewers, welcome to today's lesson. Today we will be looking at a poem, Ode to a Confederate Dead, written by Alan Tate. In today's lesson, we will be looking at how Alan Tate's philosophy about the human mind, narcissism and solipsism is reflected in this poem, and we will also be looking at the critical aspects of the poem at length. Ode to a Confederate Dead is a long poem of Alan Tate and is considered as his masterpiece. The poem describes the philosophical musings of an individual who happens to be near a Confederate cemetery on an autumn day. When he sees the large number of tombstones and the movement of the dead leaves in the wind, he goes off into a deep meditation about the cycle of life and the questions about human mortality and immortality. This poem is also considered as an exposition of the philosophical thoughts of Tate as he had explained in his essay Narcissus as Narcissus. Alan Tate is one among the foremost writers, poets and critics in the history of American literature. He is known for his involvement with the movement of New Criticism and is also one of the foremost campaigners of the Southern agrarians. He rose to fame because of his involvement in the group known as the Fugitive, which was a literary group formed by many Southern poets such as John Crow Ransom, Robert Penn Warren, Donald Davidson and Merrill Moore. The critic J.A. Bryant says that the main aim of this group as well as Tate was to demonstrate that a group of Southerners could produce important work in the medium of poetry devoid of sentimentality and carefully crafted. And they wrote in the formalistic tradition that valued the skillful use of meter and rhyme. They were also preoccupied with defending the traditional values of the agrarian South against the effects of urban industrialization, which was represented by the Northerners in America. Ode to a Confederate Dead is a lyric poem which was written by Alan Tate over a period of 10 years. It was published in 1937. It is considered as a landmark in the history of American literature due to many reasons. It was the only poem about which Tate wrote an explanatory essay entitled Narcissus as Narcissus. Secondly, in this poem, we can find the influence of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. This poem is also a perfect example of the style of writing of Tate. Emmy Bradford, a critic, says that with his preference for the lyric and for the agonized persona in that genre, along with the admiration which his ingenuities in the employment of all manner of strategies have together inspired, have confirmed his reputation for obscurity, elusive privacy and consequent difficulty. These aspects can be reflected in this poem also. The poem is in the form of a monologue and tells the thoughts of a person as he stops by the gate of a Confederate graveyard. The subject of the poem is this onlooker's thoughts and reflection upon the soldiers who died. The poem stands out because of its imagery and diction. The most important aspect of the poem is the theme of the poem, the driving thoughts of Tate about the human mortality and immortality, which is brought to the forefront as a combination of two philosophies about the human mind, narcissism and solipsism. The poem is about how Tate has skillfully linked his abstract thoughts and philosophy with the speaker of the poem and the soldiers who are dead. Dear viewers, let's now have a look at the life and works of Alan Tate. John Orley Allen Tate was an American poet, essayist and social commentator. He was elected as the Poet Laureate Consultant in Poetry to the Library of Congress from 1943 to 1944. He was born near Winchester, Kentucky, to John Orley Tate, a businessman, and Eleanor Park Custis Warner. His study at Vanderbilt University, which began in 1918, is crucial to his literary career as it is where he met his fellow poet Robert Penn Warren and where he was initiated into the group called the Fugitive. It was an informal literary group of young Southern poets under the leadership of John Crow Ransom, who ran the magazine The Fugitive, to which Tate also contributed. Tate also joined Ransom to teach at Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio. In 1924, Tate moved to New York City, where he met the poet Hart Kane. Over a 4-year period, he worked freelance for The Nation, contributed to the Hound and Horn poetry magazine. In 1928, along with other New York friends, he went to Europe. In London, he visited T.S. Eliot, whose poetry and criticism he greatly admired. In 1928, Tate published his first book of poetry, Mr. Pope and Other Poems, from which the Ode to a Confederate Dead is taken. He also published a biography titled Stonewall Jackson, The Good Soldier, in the same year. In his essay, The Fallacy of Humanism, which was published in 1929, he criticized the new humanists for creating a value system without investing it with any identifiable source of authority. In 1929, Tate published a second biography, Jefferson Davis, His Rise and Fall. These two biographies were written about the dead soldiers who had fought in the Civil Wars. After 2 years abroad, he returned to Tennessee in 1930. He resumed his senior position with the Fugitives. Along with fellow fugitives and other Southern writers, Tate joined the conservative political group known as the Southern Agrarians. The group was made up of 12 members who published essays on their political philosophy in the book I'll Take My Stand, published in 1930. Tate contributed the essay Remarks on the Southern Religion, which was followed in 1938 by an essay, Who Owns America? The Southern Agrarians Respond to the New Deal. During this time, Tate also became the de facto associate editor of the American Review, which he believed could popularize the work of the Southern Agrarians. He held the conventional social views of white aristocratic Southerner and inherited racism, a Southern legacy rooted in place and time that Tate later renounced. Tate was a poet in residence at Princeton University until 1942. He founded the creative writing program at Princeton and mentored Richard Blackmore, John Berryman, and others. In 1942, Tate assisted novelist and friend Andrew Lytle in transforming the 7-year Review, America's oldest literary quarterly, from a modest journal into one of the most prestigious in the nation. Tate died in Nashville, Tennessee. Dear viewers, before we go into a detailed discussion of the poem, it's necessary to have a look at Tate's important works and his philosophy. Tate's first book of poems, Mr. Pope and Other Poems, was published in 1928. The poem Ode to the Confederate Dead belongs to this collection. The early years of his literary career was influenced by Baudelaire, Corbière, Edwin Arlington Robinson and Ezra Pound. In 1922, when he read T.S. Eliot, he discovered a kindred spirit as he found Eliot's social and political concerns were similar to his own and admired Eliot's adherence to literary tradition. Much of Tate's major volumes of poetry were published in the 1930s, and the scholar David Havrid describes this publication history in poetry as follows. By 1937, when he published his first selected poems, Tate had written all of the shorter poems upon which his literary reputation came to rest. This collection, which brought together work from two recent volumes, Poems 1928 to 1931, which was published in 1932, and the privately printed The Mediterranean and Other Poems, which was published in 1936. As well as the earlier Mr. Pope, included Mother and Son, Last Days of Alice, The Wolves, The Mediterranean, Aeneas at Washington, Sonnets at Christmas, and the final version of Ode to a Confederate Dead. In 1938, Tate published his only novel, The Fathers, which drew upon knowledge of his mother's ancestral home and family in Fairfax County, Virginia. An important aspect of Tate's work is the publication of his essay, Narcissus as Narcissus, and his comments in this essay provide a good place to begin to understand his intent. The essay is in fact his comments on the poem Ode to a Confederate Dead, and he writes about solipsism, which he called modernity's lack of cohesion and the isolation of the individual. Tate's confrontation with modernity is at once universal and personal. Everyone living in the 20th century, Tate says in the poem, is a narcissist. But for the Southerner, this problem is particularly acute. He analyzes the poem with a close reading that is an important example of the close reading method practiced by Tate and the new critics. In the essay, Tate says that Ode to the Confederate Dead is about solipsism, a philosophical doctrine which says that we create the world in the act of perceiving it, or about narcissism or any other ism that denotes the failure of the human personality to function objectively in nature and society. New Republic contributor James Dickey also found Tate to be more than a Southern writer. Dickey wrote that Tate's situation has certain, perhaps profound implications for every man in every place and every time. And they are more than implications, they are the basic questions, the possible solutions to the question of existence. How does each of us wish to live his holy life? These are the questions that this poem tries to address. In the 7-year review, Cowen called Tate the most difficult poet of the 20th century. And this seems to be the popular opinion with many critics, particularly Brooks, who says that Tate puts a great burden upon his reader. He insists that the reader himself, by an effort of his own imagination, cooperate with the poet to bring the violent metaphors and jarring rhythms into unity. When we go through the poem Ode to a Confederate Dead, this statement becomes relevant. The beginning of the poem forms the setting of the narrative. It is an ode to the dead, and right at the outset, we are given a word picture of the numerous unnamed headstones that are described as surrendering their names and identity to the natural elements. The elements do not care for the dead, as is evident from the line, "The wind whirs without recollection." The speaker says that the only sacrament that is offered to the dead is the piled up leaves. The allusions to Christianity are noted with words such as sacrament, heaven, and the idea of a chosen few. This is a clear indication of the Christianity's belief in salvation. But unfortunately, these dead will just have to satisfy themselves with the rumor of mortality, as they cannot find their way to heaven or eternal life. The reference to the season autumn strikes the mood of the second stanza. Autumn symbolizes transformation and change, which is in sync with the rest of the narrative as he refers to the bodies that are not dead, bringing in the possibility of another life by being one with the soil, becoming manure for the soil, as is indicated by the line, "Feed the grass row, rich after rich row." The reference to November is also significant, as the Day of the Dead and the All Souls Day fall in this month. This is highly significant as the setting is a graveyard. Christian imagery is taken one step further with references to the stone angels. Ironically, even the angels wrote, shedding off bits and pieces of their paths. A feeling of unease is communicated through these lines, where we are also transformed into another world. The reference to the heavier world below could be an indirect reference to hell. A significant aspect of the stanza is the reference to the blind crab. He says at the end of the stanza, "You shift your sea space blindly, heaving, turning like the blind crab." The significance of the crab is explained by Tate himself in the essay Narcissus as Narcissus. He says in the essay, "Figure to yourself a man stopping at the gate of the Confederate cemetery. He pauses for a baroque meditation on the ravages of time, concluding with the figure of the blind crab. This creature has mobility but no direction, energy but from the human point of view no purposeful world to use it in. The crab is the first intimation of the nature of the moral conflict upon which the drama of the poem develops. The cut-offness of the modern intellectual man from the world." These lines of the poet capture the essence of the poem also. According to the speaker, the world of the Confederate dead was unified. There are references to soldiers and men at war in the poem. He also compares the rise of the infantry to the rise of the demons out of the earth. He further adds that the soldiers knew midnight restitutions, rage, heroism, the entire range of emotions that the spectator unsuccessfully attempts to evoke. He hints that the older society understood and believed what the 20th century can only analyze. The soldiers acted, but moderns are merely onlookers like the person in the narrative. We find that the onlooker is given many roles in the poem. For instance, in the third stanza, the man at the gate assumes the guise of a sociologist, and later he becomes a historian reading the old battles, but the tradition he seeks is dead. He can mummify it and so preserve the memory, but he cannot realize the heritage. Just as modernity has lost the unified vision of Parmenides and Zeno, so it has lost their heroism. Zeno and Parmenides were ancient Greek philosophers who advocated a single reality of oneness, and they defined the universe as the whole of what is possible, or the one reality view. In the poem, the poet says that Zeno's voice is muted in the present. But Tate also alludes to the philosopher's biting off his tongue so that he could not give information to his captors. Thus the poem goes on to talk about the unnamed soldiers who lie dead without anyone to sing of their glories and their chivalry. There is a reference to blood which indicates their sacrifice. He refers to the uniform of these soldiers and indicates that those who are alive could be counting their days to death. The soldiers who have outlived the dead are the only ones who remember them and the seriousness of their uniform, indicating their steadfastness to their duty and above all to their land. These soldiers who return from war are driven by a survivor's guilt, and they spend their life anticipating death and relief in death. The poet then contemplates as to what to say of the ragged arms or the ragged heads that are lost in the insane green of the cemetery. Only the spiders seem to inhabit them, and the owl, in its shield of invisibility provided by the night, sings about the brave deeds of these soldiers. He also alludes to the fact that it is only the dead leaves that fly about and plunge and expire, whispering the secrets of the night. The reference to night here is highly symbolic, and it is said in the poem that it indicates both the beginning and the end. If night is taken as a symbol of death, night as the beginning and end would bring back the Christian allusion to salvation, where death in one life refers to beginning of another life, the eternal life. Here we find the poet addressing the questions of mortality and immortality. The wait in between referred to in the poem could also indicate the wait at the purgatory, indicating the judgment day in the Christian belief. The use of the simile of the jaguar leaping to his own death by leaping at his own image in the water is highly ironical and symbolic. He is indicating that a part of the self, an image of the self, is responsible for the annihilation of the self. He further talks about knowledge, which could be the knowledge of the self. Some aspects of this knowledge or the avoidance of this knowledge leading to the death of the self. He is saying that people who have narcissistic tendencies of the self takes this knowledge to the grave. The extortion of the poet to leave the gate is interesting, as he might be indicating that the knowledge of the self should keep us safe from the gate. He is referring to his philosophy here. The reference to the serpent as a sentinel who decided the people who enter the gate is highly pertinent. The description of the snake as gentle and green among the mulberry bush is quite striking. The reference to the original sin, the basis of Christian tenets, is evoked here, as it is Satan in the form of a snake who leads the first man to sin, plunging mankind into death and mortality. It is his philosophical insights that get reflected in the poem. His view that the modern world lacks in faith and religion is reflected in the allusions to Christianity and the biblical story of Satan and man's initiation into sin at his hands. Tate's role as a campaigner of the South is evident in the poem when he praises the Civil War heroes. This poem has to be seen in connection with the biography of the Civil War heroes that he wrote, pointing to the importance he gave to the unsung sacrifice of these heroes for their homeland. Not surprisingly, Tate's poetry had seemed to come from a direct sensuous apprehension of the Southern experience, the Southern people, animals, terrain, and climate, said Donald H. Stanford in the Southern Review. In many of his poems, Tate confronted the relationship between an idealized past and a present deficient in both faith and tradition. The Old South was semi-feudal, agrarian, backward-looking, and religious, much like the European countries of the Middle Ages. This aspect is reflected through the allusions he uses in this poem. Some critics have detected in Tate's work a return to somewhat medieval patterns of thought. In Renaissance, Sister Mary Bernetta wrote, "In the Middle Ages there was one drama which took precedence over all other conflict, the struggle of every man to win beatitude and to escape eternal reprobation." Tate recognizes the issue as a subject most significant for literature. Tate uses the graveyard and the dead Confederate soldiers as a metaphor for his narrator's troubled state of mind, and the poem charts the narrator's dark stream of consciousness as he contemplates, or he tries to avoid contemplating, his own mortality. This 92-line stream of consciousness meditation contrasts modern man with the heroes of the Civil War. Originally called an elegy, the poem's form suggests John Milton's Lycidas, which is at once a lament for the dead Edward King and an examination of life in the 1630s. Similarly, Alan Tate both eulogizes the fallen Confederate soldiers and analyzes the plight of those living in the 20th century. Written largely in iambic pentameter, the poem also employs hexameter, tetrameter, and trimeter. The poem oscillates between the regularity and formality associated with the sections portraying antique heroism and irregular rhythms reflecting the conflict of that world. Like the rhythm, the rhyme scheme also varies. The second stanza, for example, begins with a quatrain and the third with a couplet. Rhymes recur at unpredictable intervals. Thus, tomorrow in the third stanza echoes grow, row, and willow in the second. Through these devices also, Alan Tate has been able to communicate his sense of the theme. And these aspects also tell us about the importance he gave to the formalistic aspects of the poem. Dear viewers, today we have looked at the poem Ode to a Confederate Dead written by Alan Tate and have seen how his philosophy is reflected in the poem. Hope you enjoyed this session. Thank you and see you again in another session.